Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Weed Watcher training online for the first time. I'm Harry Wolhandler with the Harrisville, New Hampshire Conservation Commission, and I welcome you and encourage you to let people know about this webinar. It will be broadcast, available online once it closes. I wanted to share this widely now that we can share it widely, following the many eyes theory of safety that flocks of birds and schools of fish have. The more people can look out in the ponds and find invasive weeds, the earlier we catch things, the better we can prevent them. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to Amy Smagula, New Hampshire DES, for the rest of the program. Thanks.
Well, welcome everyone. I certainly wish that we could be doing this Weed Watcher training in person, but given the circumstances of the pandemic currently, we're doing everything remotely. So I'm hoping that this is a timely Weed Watcher program for a training and a refresher, whatever applies to those of you who are interested in going out on your water body and doing some searching for invasive species so that we can keep our lakes and ponds and even rivers in New Hampshire looking clean. So the presentation is going to include these topics. Why weed watch? And I should preface that by saying that it's sort of whatever watching. We're not just looking for invasive plants, we're looking for invasive animals or anything else that looks out of place in the water. We'll talk about the status of infestations in New Hampshire, weed watch methods. We'll go through plants and animals that you should be aware of, how to identify specimens, and then what happens if you find an invasive. I anticipate that the presentation will take between 35 and 40 minutes. I understand some folks might need to step away early, so I can assure you that I will be converting this to a video and we'll be putting it out on YouTube. And for those of you who have registered for this webinar, I will be providing a link to you via email probably sometime next week after we get this out on YouTube. So you can view it in its entirety at a later date. And you can also share it with other members of your associations and even with your municipalities so that you can spread the message widely. So why develop a Weed Watcher program? It is a very proactive approach at protecting your water body. The goal is to catch infestations early before they become advanced, which is at a time when it is almost impossible to eradicate them when they are fully developed. So finding something early and reporting it early will facilitate a rapid response towards management, and will also prevent the further spread of species. So the status of infestations in New Hampshire right now, we have over 90 water bodies in the state that have some type of infestation. You can see here the list of the common ones that we have in the state, and they are numerous. The red dots are pretty telling. That's variable milfoil in New Hampshire, and that is the most prevalent and also the one that has been in New Hampshire the longest. And it is in a number of water bodies. And then we have a scattering of other plants in the state throughout different parts of the state. And then we also had animals start creeping in the form of Chinese mystery snails in the mid-80s. And then we had Asian clam come in within the last decade. So invasive species are varied, and I think soon we're going to have to change the name of the program from Weed Watchers to something else to be more inclusive of all of these different species that we might see, including fish and other organisms in the future. You might notice that in the northern part of the state, we don't have any infestations documented. We're uncertain as to why. These water bodies certainly could support them, and they do receive transient boaters, which are the primary vector of spread for most of these, but they just haven't shown up there yet. Those of you who would like to see what is growing near you, we have this map, and it's an interactive map on the DES website. We have this link down here in the corner on the bottom right, and you can click that when you have the slideshow, or you could simply Google NHDES Lake Mapper, And this interface will come up on the left. You're able to zoom in on it. And if you do, I've provided a little zoom in here on the upper right. That dialog box will pop up and you can click on different links in there to see what types of infestations are in that water body. And if it has a management plan, you can also find maps and water quality information there as well. So looking at the Connecticut River here, you can see that it has a few different invasive plants and the years that they were documented in that system. So for wherever you are in the state, you can certainly see what's near you in terms of infested water bodies and what's going on in terms of management for those. So the program mantra, if you will, is prevention, early detection, rapid response, and management when it comes to invasive species. And a lot of these are very important to keep going hand in hand because they matter. You want to try to prevent new infestations first and early, and then you want to try to find them early if they do happen to get into the system. Rapid response occurs if something is found. We can respond very quickly, usually the same day or the next day if you find something. And I'll talk more about that towards the end, as well as management and how we deal with management. So we'll go through all of that. Prevention efforts, just to highlight some of these, we're really promoting the clean, drain, dry protocols in New Hampshire, and it's a national effort as well, so that we can have people making sure that when they arrive at a water body, their boats and fishing gear and other recreational equipment is clean and free of species, so they don't cause new infestations when they arrive. We encourage you, if you don't already, to participate or support the Lake Coast program. This is run by the New Hampshire Lakes Association, and it provides courtesy boat inspectors and educators at public access sites across the state so that boaters are educated and gear is inspected before boats are launched. And then we also have free signage and information and pamphlets we can provide to you to post at kiosks so that you can get the word out locally about invasive species. So early detection and survey work take place in a couple of ways in New Hampshire. We do have, unfortunately, only a handful of state biologists that get out on water bodies to do monitoring. So we do need more eyes and ears out there, and that is the intent of the Lake Coast program, is to have more eyes on the water. So early detection with the Weed Watcher program is certainly a huge component of finding things early on a water body. So what's involved? The Weed Watcher program is intended to be simple. We know that everybody has very busy lives, so we want to make sure that this will integrate into the time you have at the lake. The volunteers are trained for monitoring water bodies for invasive species. This is a very similar presentation that I would do if I were in person with Weed Watchers to go through the methods and the steps. We ask that you just monitor once a month from May through September. That is the prime growing season for invasive species. And it doesn't need to be every day. It doesn't need to be every week. You can certainly look for invasive species every time you're out, but truly just once a month from May through September is great. And something that a lot of people who are new to the program worry about, you do not need to be an expert in biology to be a weed watcher. You don't need to start with any experience. We will train you in the species that you should be looking for. And I always like to say that if you are worried about anything, feel free to take a picture or send a specimen and we can identify it. And through that, you will learn how to do identifications. The resources that DES provides, or the Department of Environmental Services, we provide a Weed Watcher kit. And in that kit, we have methods for weed watching, which I'm going through as we go through this webinar. Pictures of key invasive species. It also has fact sheets on a number of the species. It has maps on, you could have maps for subject lakes. We provide those either through that online interactive mapping system that I went through a couple of slides ago, or you can email me and request a map for your water body that has depth contours as well as historic plant maps so that you have a baseline for what's been in your lake in the past. And then we also provide tailored slideshows of the plants that we know are in your lake. So you have photographs of each of those so that you can learn those. And I like to tell people you can ignore them because they are the natives and those are the ones that are good to have there. And then that way you sort of set a filter and start looking for invasive species or the bad species you don't want. So if you don't already have a slideshow created for your water body, just email me and I will prepare one for you. We ask that you share the slideshow with fellow lake residents, and if you have a website for the Lake Association, you can certainly post it on there so it's fairly well accessible. The equipment needs on your end are fairly small. A lot of people like to use a small boat with a short shaft motor, something that will let you get into the shallows. Or you can get out on whatever you want to. I have a probably not exhaustive list of all of the different vessels and toys and exercise equipment or whatever you can think of to get out there on the water body. I do recommend though, if you have a motor boat, that you have a driver and one or more observers to do the weed watching. If you are on a motorized vessel, it just makes it easier. While you're out there, I encourage you your lake outline map, pens, pencils for taking notes. We have plant identification keys in that kit for you to take with you. Small long-handled rakes are available to make, and I have instructions on how to do that. Those are useful if you would like to have the ability to reach deeper down into the water body to capture something that might just be out of reach from the boat. Certainly if you have divers or snorkelers on the lake who would like to dive in and grab something, that would be useful for them to go get that for you, a plant or a mussel or a clam or something like that. It's useful to have sample baggies or maybe a bucket with you while you're out doing your weed watching so that you have a place to put the samples. The plants dry out very quickly if you just throw them in the bottom of your kayak or on the bottom of a boat. So they do need to be put into a bag. And two other pieces of equipment, polarized sunglasses, I personally feel are invaluable. I have them on all the time, and they really do help cut the glare from the sun on the surface of the water, letting you see deeper down in. And for some reason, I find that the brown lensed polarized sunglasses work a lot better than the gray lensed. And these are not the ones that are several $100s. The $10 or $20 pair from, the local drugstore or supermarket work just fine. They don't need to be specialized. And then a view scope. Many of you participate in volunteer monitoring and use a view scope when you do your Secchi disc readings for seeing down into the lake. The view scope works well also for weed watching to help you see down into the water body. So this map, this figure here gives you an idea of the overall methods of weed watching. This lake is not nearly as pretty as the lakes that we have across New Hampshire, but it gets the message across. So weed watchers shouldn't feel responsible for taking on the entire water body. That can be a daunting task. So what we recommend is that as a lake association or as a group of weed watchers, you look at your lake and you break it down into bite-sized pieces. So shoreline sections, maybe, whatever's comfortable to paddle would be reasonable to break the lake into. Some people have anywhere from 4 or 5 to maybe 10 or 12 sections of their water body, depending on how big your lake or pond is. And then have volunteers sign up for those sections. On this schematic at the top and the bottom, I have volunteer Kate and volunteer John doing the top section and the bottom section. And then when you're out there, it's important to try to cover as much area as possible of the shallows. And by that, I mean anywhere where you start at shore and go out to where sunlight will penetrate down to the lake bottom. That is a zone of growth for plants, and that's the place that you would expect to find any type of growth that could be problematic. So to do that, I recommend either doing parallel lines that go from shore out to that deep line where you can't see anymore, or zigzags from shore out to deeper water. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's just covering that distance in your weed watching efforts is very critical, because that is where you will find something. At first, it's going to seem very daunting to new weed watchers, but I can assure you that after, a couple times doing your section, you'll become very familiar with it, and it will become sort of a routine for you. While you're out there, we encourage you to scan the surface for any floating plants, and also scan down to the bottom and look through the water column to see if you have any plants that look suspicious, or if there are any animals down on the bottom that look like they might be something that is not native. So what are you looking for? You're looking for anything in the water that is new or out of place. So for reference, something that might not have been there last month, something that wasn't there last year, you are the expert of your water body. You live on it, you know it, and you will notice that change. Look for anything that appears to be growing quickly or taking over, appearing bigger each month. Certainly in the spring, you're going to notice that the native plants are coming back and filling in, and that's natural. But invasive plants tend to grow an inch a day very quickly, and you might start to see something emerging that looks like it's getting out of control. So those are things to look for. Also, for plants, if you see a lot of fragments drifting around on the surface of the water, it could be a sign of an infestation. Variable milfoil, for one, is notorious for breaking pieces of itself off and drifting around. For animals, anything like mussels or clams or snails that appear to be very high in number. I know there are some lakes that have a lot of native mussels that it's totally normal for that, but just look at them and see if they look like they belong or if they look different than what you've been seeing for years. And then any animals like snails or, like clams or mussels that are stuck to surfaces, those could be zebra mussels because they do like to stick to surfaces, and I'll show some pictures of that in a moment. So if you find something, it's very difficult to go back to the exact spot in a lake. Yesterday, I was trying to find a buoy on a lake that I had submersed by 3 feet over the winter so it didn't get snagged in the ice. And it was difficult to find, even though I had a GPS and I had a general idea of where it was in that area. So mark it with the buoy at the surface. Take a GPS point if you have a GPS unit or an app on your phone. Triangulation, take notes. It's off from this point and off the blue house and off from some other shoreline reference so that you remember about where it was. You can put a piece of flagging, like survey flagging, on the shoreline near where you saw something to draw the eye and go back to that spot. And take notes on the site. What distance is it offshore? What's the water depth? Is there a landmark or an address nearby, or house color that you can note? Just anything to find that spot again. Then once you've marked the spot, I recommend that you carefully collect a voucher specimen. Unfortunately, because we're short-staffed, we can't go out and investigate every possible infestation in the state. So what we recommend is a voucher specimen that we can look at and determine if it is something invasive or native. If it's an animal, I encourage you to only take one and preferably photograph it and return it in case it is a rare species. We have a fingernail clam in New Hampshire that is actually rare, and it looks somewhat like an Asian clam. So it's very important to just put it back until we know exactly what it is, but a photograph is great. If it's a plant, collect it and be careful not to let a piece float away. So collect any pieces that you might break off. And if there happen to be stems or leaves or flowers or fruit, please collect that as well, because it might be helpful in the identification of the plant. So with the pandemic, of course, we are trying to limit our contact with specimens. So what to do with your voucher specimen? The best option is to email me a digital photo of what you found. So take whatever specimen you found and put it on a piece of white paper or a paper towel or a napkin. Arrange it so that the leaves and the flowers or the animal are clearly seen. They're not all bunched up. Place a coin or some other scaled item like a ruler next to the specimen so I have an idea of scale. And then take a digital picture of it and then just email that to me. Most of you who have sent me specimens by email know that I'll respond pretty quickly with an identification. So it's sort of instantaneous gratification if you want a quick answer. The alternate option, which is less optimal and will probably still take a fair amount of time, is actual mail. We are still working remotely and we are not in the lab very much, so I fear for the state of mailed in specimens. But if that's the only option that's available to you, we'll make that work. So just wrap the specimen in a moist paper towel, seal it in a Ziploc baggie of some type of resealable bag, and then mail it to me at the Hazen Drive address in Concord that's shown here. So let's take a look at some of these plants and animals that you do not want to have in your water body. I do have one native plant that I've included in the mix here, and I will point that out. But going forward, all of the photos I'm going to show you are invasive plants in the state. So they are not plants that we want. So earlier I said it's important to scan the surface and look down through the water column of the water body. But I also want to encourage you to look at your shoreline when you're close to shore. There are a couple of invasive plants that are threatening if they do start to pop up. Purple loosestrife was under control for a number of years in New Hampshire, but last summer I noticed that we did have quite a boost of them. So I don't know what this summer will hold. Purple loosestrife plants can produce up to 2.5 million seeds for a mature plant and spread very quickly. So it's something that you want to find early before it does set seed. It has these big purple stalks and the leaves are opposite or whorled on the stem, and the stem is square and woody. So you're not going to find this one in the lake. It's going to be maybe moist feet up on shore of the water body. And then another one is common reed or Phragmites. This one might find its way into your lake community by roadway. It likes the salty margins of roadways, and it is quite tall. It can grow 10 to 15 feet tall. It has long leaves and these big brown seed heads late in the season. And what happens is on the shore of water bodies, we start to get these stands of Phragmites, and they send these runners out. And every place where these runners or rhizomes set down, they grow roots. And that is how they make their entry into a lake system. There's a lake in southern New Hampshire that had islands of this forming out in the lake and peninsulas growing off from shore. So it's a very important one to take a look at. Any place where you have roadways right along the lake or you have culverts crossing under roads coming into the lake is a place where Phragmites could get a foothold. So moving a little bit deeper out into the water body, luckily there aren't a lot of floating leaved plants that could be a problem in the state that we've recognized so far. Water chestnut is one of them, and you're going to find this one mixed in with your lily pad zone. The good thing is it doesn't look anything like a lily pad. It has all these little leaves that form a rosette on the surface. And it has this little seed down in the bottom right-hand corner that can cause the plant to grow. The good thing with this one is if the plant is all chopped up, the plant itself isn't going to cause new plants to grow. The seed will though. So luckily if we find this one early and pick it before it goes to seed, we can successfully control this one before your water body looks like this. This plant can grow and cover acres of water body in very short time frame. So the underwater ones, these are hard for everybody, including me. Variable milfoil was the one that had the red dots all over the map that I showed earlier. This one can grow 12 to 15 feet tall and cause quite a mess, as you can see from these photos. This is the biggest threat to most water bodies across New Hampshire. This is where it gets very thick and it tops out near the surface. But it doesn't always start like that. This variable milfoil often has single stems that come up from the bottom. So sometimes you might see this. This is what I just showed you, a little advanced with a few more stems clustering. This one is very similar. This is Eurasian water milfoil. This is on only a few water bodies in New Hampshire, but it looks a lot like variable milfoil. And then we have fanwort. This one is a little different looking. With the variable milfoil that we had and the Eurasian water milfoil, those had feather-like leaves. This has leaves that are fan-shaped and opposite, and underwater it looks a lot like the variable milfoil or the Eurasian water milfoil, but you really do have to get these plants in hand and take a close look at them. That's why voucher specimens are very important. And don't be fooled by bladderwort. I know a lot of you have been fooled by bladderwort in the past. It looks a lot like milfoils. The dead giveaway is these little seeds that you see on the leaves here. They can be green or white or black, but the plant itself can look a lot like milfoil. So take the leaves and look at them very closely. You can see some close-up shots of the leaves here. I mentioned that I was going to point out a native. This is that native. Bladderwort is a native in New Hampshire. It's not invasive, despite the fact that it likes to wash up on people's beaches, get stuck in your toes, get stuck in your boat engines. It is a native, so we should keep an eye out for it and just be aware that it could look like milfoil, and when in doubt, it's something that you should get an identification on. The, oops, gotta go back a couple. The curly leaf pondweed is one that I'm starting to see show up in southern New Hampshire and in other parts of the state, like western New Hampshire. This one likes slightly higher pH waters, which New Hampshire doesn't have a lot of, but we do have pockets of it in the state. So as you get close to the Massachusetts border and as you get close to the western border of New Hampshire over towards Vermont, this one certainly could be a factor. We have a lot of pondweeds in New Hampshire that are very native and perfectly all right. But this one is a low grower and it has leaves that are, as you can see here, very wavy and curly. And it is definitely the invasive pondweed species to be on the lookout for. Another one that's kind of hard to see, and this one can be confused easily with water naiad natives that we have. This one is Spiny Naiad, and you can see the close-up of the plant here. It has spines on it. The leaves themselves are curled backwards on the stem, and this one is a super low grower. It only grows about 6 inches tall off the bottom, and it sort of forms an understory right over your lake sediments, and it can get quite thick and grow very quickly. It is a seed producer, and it really likes to get going usually in July when the water temperatures are very warm. So just keep an eye out for this one. If you start to notice like a ground cover on your lake bottom, if you will, that looks like this, just let me know. It's one of the species that I've started to see more and more across the state. So it's one that I want to alert folks to. And then this one is another underwater one. We do not have this yet in New Hampshire, but it's in every state around us except Vermont. I think this one will be, if we get it, one of the biggest threats from invasive aquatic plants that we have in New Hampshire. It can grow 25 feet tall. It can grow up from deep, dark water before it leafs out. So it's quite adaptive at dealing with dark water, and it's quite a threat. So hydrilla is in many states now, and it's very difficult to control. So it looks a lot like the native water weeds that we have in New Hampshire. We have 2 native water weeds. And every couple of years, we have a banner water weed year where we tend to have the natives grow 2 or 3 feet tall very quickly. So it's very important to take some photos of those as close up to the leaves as you can. The hydrilla has leaves, like this call out shows here, that are serrated on the edges, and they are distinct. The natives have smooth leaves, so you can kind of tell the difference. Sometimes you might need a hand lens to take a close look at them. So moving on to some of the animals that we have, or that could be coming. Asian clam have become fairly well established in about 7 water bodies in New Hampshire. They are small. They're roughly the diameter of a dime or a quarter, and they are hermaphroditic. So getting one Asian clam into your water body is all it takes, because they can individually create a population. So these clams have very distinct ridges. So if you run your fingernail over the shell, you can feel the ridges quite easily. The native fingernail clam that I mentioned earlier that we have to be careful of is very smooth. It doesn't have those ridges. So that's a characteristic to look for differences. This is what it looks like when you have Asian clam in a water body. These are all the discarded shells from old mussels, old clams. And you can see that they do pile up in fish beds, and they do litter the bottom quite thickly in some locations. So this could potentially cause habitat issues for fish. It can definitely cause food web issues because they filter feed a lot of the algae out of the water column and the other good stuff that's microscopic in there. And they can also recycle nutrients very quickly. So they can possibly cause cyanobacteria blooms as well. The Chinese mystery snail is probably one of our oldest invasive aquatic animals in the state. We have records of them back into the mid-80s. And these are large. They're about the size of an apricot or a golf ball. And none of our natives are that big. So if you're finding snails in your water body that are this large, they are definitely the Chinese mystery snail or another similar mystery snail. There are several mystery snails. So my recommendation for these is to grab them as you see them and either toss them in the trash or in the woods far away from water so that you thin out the population. My recommendation for Asian clam is not that because they're just so small and so numerous, but I'll include these in my management discussion in a couple of minutes, but that is my recommendation for those. I know a lot of people ask about that one. The zebra mussel is not here yet in New Hampshire. It is roughly the size of a pistachio nut. And then if you look at the shells that are shown here, you can see that they have either beige and brown or black and white banding on them, which is distinctive. And then they also have this sticky strand-like material that comes out of their shell. So these are going to stick to hard surfaces. So the first one I showed you, the Asian clam, is going to be down on your lake bottom. This one is going to be stuck to your docks, your boats, your anything in the water, basically. Here you see that the zebra mussels are stuck to a native mussel in the photo. So those are small and something to look for. Again, not in New Hampshire yet. They are in Massachusetts, probably as the closest state, in Vermont as well. So 2 of our border states do have these. And then finally, the spiny water flea. We do not have this yet in New Hampshire. We're actively monitoring for it when we look at our plankton samples. This guy's little. It is small. You can see on the left-hand side, these are several spiny water fleas stuck to fishing line. And then over on the right, there's a spiny water flea sitting on somebody's finger. So they are little, but those spines are made out of glass and silica, and they are problematic in the food chain, affecting fish and fish health because of digestive issues that are caused by the spiny water flea. So what if you find a new infestation? Well, the photos that I showed you of the plants and the animals are just a few of the things to be looking for. We actually have 29 prohibited plants, and then there are several species of fish and mollusks that are listed as invasive and problematic in New Hampshire. And we don't expect you to know all of those, but anytime you're in doubt and you want an identification, please take a picture or send a specimen in, preferably the photo. Get it verified by state biologists first so we're sure of what it is. If it is a non-native species, like I said earlier, our response is quick. We'll be out that day that we do the ID or the next day to survey your water body and map the infestation. We will do containment actions if possible, depending on the type and location of the infestation. We'll do management actions and plan them based on the type and size of infestation. And we'll develop a long-term management plan for your water body to help guide management and identify resources that we need to be protective of. The mapping is quite comprehensive. We use handheld GPS or geographic positioning system units to accurately pinpoint where the growth is. This map here gives you an example of what we do with the data. We will delineate areas like this orange area on the map that is slated for herbicide treatment because this happens to be the European Naiad plant. Or the Spiny Naiad. It was just too dense in that area, so we had to designate that as a treatment zone. All of the red flags indicate locations where growth is sparse, so divers can actively take care of it. And then you see a couple areas that have blue hash marks over them, and those are areas where we can put bottom blankets down on the lake bottom to cover some of those patches. They're small but dense. So we have a lot of options, and we try to delineate that by mapping and keeping accurate maps of infestations. And then for the management plan, the long-term management plan, all of our water bodies that are infested are difficult to deal with for various reasons. Invasive species themselves are adaptive, so we in turn have to be adaptive in our management. So that means regular mapping and monitoring, making recommendations for what works best for a management practice, and then adapting to whether that works well or not, and then moving on to other techniques if it becomes more difficult to manage the infestation. We do have a lot of control actions available to us. I want to point out that one size does not fit all. If you have a couple of plants, we're not going to move to an herbicide treatment. We're going to actively try to hand remove those plants or do diver-assisted suction harvesting to get rid of those. So we try to start with the smallest or easiest technique first before we move on to the more complicated and complex and expensive control techniques. Mechanical harvesting sounds like a great idea, but a lot of our underwater plants are spread by fragmentation, pieces of the plant drifting off and settling. So we're not going to mechanically harvest those because we'll just cause worse problems. We will use mechanical harvesting on water chestnut though, because it is a seed producer and it doesn't spread by pieces. So we strategically look at the type and size of the infestation and decide which control techniques are best. When we do management, we bring in contractors who are licensed to do this type of work. DES only does the mapping and makes recommendations. And then we bring in the contractors to do the work. So funding, this is always a question that comes up. How does it get paid for? Certainly prevention and early detection activities that I talked about earlier are critical because they are on the cheaper end of the spectrum, low cost, definitely more volunteer time, which is certainly valuable, but it makes a difference. And you will spend a lot less money in the long run if you have strong prevention and early detection activities. If you have an infestation that goes unchecked because you don't have weed watchers or nobody reports something, then you will have a large scale infestation, which will be expensive to manage. For the first new infestation, the state will pay 100% of the management cost. Follow-up management, however, requires local match dollars. The best option that I can recommend is to work locally. We have milfoil committees or invasive species committees in towns across New Hampshire, and it's a combination of lake association members as well as people who sit on conservation commissions and boards of selectmen or town administrators to strategize for possible local funding. Establish a trust fund or some type of non-lapsing, continually appropriated fund on the town level. It could be line item budgeting or warrant articles or donations or something like that to come up with a match towards what the state will give in a grant any given year. We have a fixed budget with increasing numbers of infestations. So every year that we find new infestations, it gets harder and harder to make those dollars go farther. So having some local funding to help match is useful. I do know that a lot of people are out there looking at all different types of things, so I wanted to point out that there are 3 different categories of invasive species in New Hampshire. So invasive aquatic plants are handled under the Department of Environmental Services, and I'm the primary contact for that program. If you happen to be looking on land, so at terrestrial species, and this could include plants or insects, sort of like the Japanese knotweed or bittersweet or the emerald ash borer or other things like that, Doug Saigan is the person to contact at the Department of Agriculture. And then if you find invasive aquatic animals, they should be reported to the Fish and Game Department. Scott Decker is the liaison there for taking feedback about the invasive aquatic animals in the state, or could direct you to somebody if you find something on land. Now, with all of that said, the different species, how we respond, I have to say at this point that the prognosis for invasive aquatic plant management is far better than for invasive animal management. There are not a lot of great techniques out there for successfully managing invasive aquatic animals at this point. There are research projects underway to identify those. So that's why we rely heavily on the clean, drain, dry messaging that we use to try to prevent new infestations and then try to contain them before allowing them to spread elsewhere. So early detection is very useful. I can't guarantee that we'll jump right in and do management because the science might not be there yet to guide us in terms of particularly animals, but we will do our best to protect other water bodies in the area and assess what's going on in an individual water body. So do report what you find and we will take it from there and definitely work with you as we do our assessments and make recommendations for management. So that's all I have for formal presentation. I'm going to take a look and see if we have any comments or chats along the way. I see a couple of people have had audio problems. I'm hoping that those were resolved along the way. Those were at the very beginning, and I think we may have turned audio on. I'm not seeing any other questions that have been posted. So if you have any other questions, if anybody has any questions, please do use the chat function in your little dialog box that's on your screen. And I'll just hold on for a second. So will the presentation be sent to attendees is a question that just came up. Yes, I have recorded this webinar and I will be posting it out on YouTube. We're going to be doing that through the Department of Environmental Services YouTube channel. And if you are on this webinar, you obviously registered for the webinar and I have your email address. So probably next week sometime once we get it posted, I will follow up with an email to each of you and I will make sure that you each have a link to this recording. So please continue to post those chats. I'll keep looking for them. So one question that just came in, I saw in the news this week that the state was cutting the water quality monitoring programs this year. What is the impact? So due to the pandemic, we are also, like everybody else, stuck with the social distancing guidelines. And what that means is that we have smaller capacity for staff in our laboratory. So our laboratory and our other state laboratories. So we have minimized some of the sampling that we're doing. For instance, we're not adding new lakes to our lake assessment program. For the exotic species program, I'm only doing surveys for water bodies that have contracted management practices on them. Our volunteer lake assessment program is operating differently. And Sarah Steiner from that program has sent out guidance for that. So it's a sheer capacity type of thing that has limited us. There has been discussion that we're not testing our freshwater beaches for E. coli, which is still up for discussion. We're definitely monitoring our coastal beaches. But yeah, the landscape for us is very different in how we're responding right now. We are here. We are glad to answer questions. Just understand that for right now, email is the best way to reach us because most of us are still working at home. And if we do go into the lab or to the office, we've been asked to minimize our time there. So it's definitely creative in terms of how we're doing things. Another question, how much time is usually invested on a small pond, about 60 acres? I'm not quite sure I understand. For a season on a small pond. So I'm assuming that's regarding weed watcher time or monitoring time. I would say that most volunteers are out doing weed watching maybe for a half an hour to an hour a month. And then you multiply that out by however many weed watchers you have on your water body to, get an amount of time. I say integrate it right into your activities on the water so that you can just look while you're out fishing or boating, and just kind of make it fun for you while you're out there. How do we get pictures of invasive weeds or weed watcher kits? So you can just email me. My email is at the bottom of this screen. You can email me and I can mail you a weed watcher kit so that you can have one. I'm going to email the YouTube link. So the interactive map that I mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow was the DES, so Department of Environmental Services Lake Mapper. So if you just Google that, that will get you to the interface to get into the mapping program, and you can go from there and click on different water bodies and see all of the records that we have on them. Does the state keep track of volunteer hours for funding match? If so, how can we report our weed watcher time? We don't keep track of that. We recommend that you do locally if there are efforts where your match time could be used to leverage a local grant for some type of management or some type of natural resources improvement or protection. So that's a good way to use those volunteer hours. I would love to hear what your hours are so that I can keep track of them, just, to share how New Hampshire does with volunteer monitoring. So if you'd like to share, feel free, but I personally don't keep track of those for the program. I keep track of the lakes that are in the program and roughly how many volunteers are doing weed watching on those water bodies. But from day to day, those could change as people move in, move out. So I don't have an accurate record on my end. You mentioned mussels are larger than normal infestations. Are the types of mussels changing at all? Is the size of mussels changing? So that's an interesting question. Mussel, so the native mussel, the big oval mussel reproduction, they have boom and bust years, but you will start to see as they have a new age class coming up, they will be the smaller mussels that will progress in size over time. So you might just have a young age class if you're noticing a lot of your native mussels are smaller than typical. If you start to see anything that looks clam-like or zebra mussel-like, those are the two primary clam and mussel species that we're worried about right now. So those are good ones to check. But as to the native mussels, they grow up just like the rest of us. So you will notice different age classes out there. Let's see, I think I've gone through all of the questions that have come in to date. I do want to thank you all for hanging in there on a Saturday morning. I hope that you guys can go out there and enjoy the weather before it turns on us this afternoon. I wish you all well. I encourage you to email me if you have any questions. And please do consider weed watching if you don't already. If you are weed watching, thank you so much for your efforts out there on the water. they truly do make a difference. I've had weed watchers that have found single stems of invasive plants. So, and they were not experts and they were fairly new weed watchers. So have faith in your abilities. It's definitely easier than you think it is, and just keep a good eye out. Thank you all.